Hi, welcome back to Battleboards. My name's Richard, and today in this movie you're going to be looking at how I design the Battleboards layouts, which can be quite complicated. So there's a process that I go through, which you may find interesting, and so I hope you enjoy this movie. Okay, the most important thing to obviously decide first is what the terrain's going to look like. So reference plays an important part in deciding what the actual board will look like. So we've got several types we can look at. We can look at photographic reference, which is always good if the terrain exists. But often the terrain doesn't exist, so we have to look at other media. So concept art of reference from games is a very good one, because obviously they're aiming the concept art at the various different games. And if you're into historical battles, then obviously old historical photographs are perfect for working out what the terrain's going to look like. The other interesting terrain reference is movie reference, which is often wanted by my clients. So in that way we can look at an actual movie scene or segment and actually build a terrain around that. Or even a book will do as well. Once you've decided what project you would like to do, and you've looked at the reference and decided what style you want, then it's a case of then moving on to how to visualize that project so we both understand it. One way to do this is for me to provide these sketches or concept art sketches. I create these in quite an unusual way because it's important to make sure that the concept sketch actually matches the terrain scale. It's no point in me making a really good terrainscape if it doesn't actually work out when we actually come to build it. The way I do this is by doing a simple 3D model of the actual boards before I even do the sketch. I can then put my tracing paper or layout paper over the top of these renders and then sketch over the top, making sure that the actual sketch that I do is to scale. This example shows 28mm Space Marines on it, which will give me a good guide to how big the actual terrain is going to be. But that's not all I can do. The software allows me to add objects in as well. These will be to scale, and I can then reference back to these scales when actually building the terrain. It's a really useful way of actually working out how big everything's going to be before the terrain's even been started. Here's another great example of how this can work. This 3D model represents a 4-foot by 4-foot table of an Italian village set on a large hillside, based around 1939. I needed to make several scale miniature buildings to fit into the layout. I used the 3D software to work out where the buildings were going to go and how many I needed, and more importantly how big they needed to be. So I made virtual representations of each building before I even started to make them. This allows me to move virtually around the board and see what effect the building and the structures have on the overall terrain. I can then check for pinch points or line of sight for where miniatures can see other miniatures, giving a balance to the overall game. Let's now have a closer look at how the board looked when it was finished. When comparing the 3D model with the final board, you can see that it's pretty close, and the client was more than happy and was amazed at how the final board looked like the concept. I can take this idea of using 3D models for making the terrain layout even further and make completely virtual boards. These would give you an amazing idea of what the board would actually look like prior to me making it. Let's start by having another look at a finished project. This is another 4-foot by 4-foot table made for a company called Fantastic Plastic Little Men. So I made up this small gaming table for them to play a game called Bushido, which is an oriental game, and also be used for things like Warhammer. But they needed to know what the table would look like before I made it. So I made this virtual board for them so they could actually look and see what the board looked like before I started the project. Again, this enabled me to spin around the board and look at the various angles, if you like, of the board and how it would look. I then rendered different views of the board, which I then emailed to them so they could approve the board scale and design. So why go to all this trouble just to create a design that they can look at? This is great for making sure that I know and understand what the project's involvement will be, as the last thing I want to do is make a mistake and have to remake something after I've finished it, which could be catastrophic. So what more can the software do to help? Let's look at this example of how I can copy and paste objects. I've just copied this tree and pasted it into a new location. This I can then spin around and see how it affects the board. This is a perfect way to give the client choices of how many trees, say, that he wishes to buy and what they would look like on the board if placed in this location. It's a great way of experimenting with different products, adding them to the board and seeing what effect it will have. Using this method, I can create a whole forest without actually having the trees at hand, making it far easier for me to show what it would look like without having to purchase loads of trees. This enabled them to make informed decisions about where to spend their budget and how many trees they would like to purchase. And as these virtual trees were made using photographs of the actual model custom trees we could make and provide, made this representation almost perfect. I then rendered out these images and then emailed them to the client for their approval. This gave them the confidence in knowing how many trees they needed to purchase to complete the display how they wanted it to look. Well, that's pretty fantastic if you just want to know how many trees you want. But let's have a look at what effect that has on the overall board design and the decision making that a client would have throughout the process. Let's have a look at this 6 foot by 4 foot Warhammer 40,000 terrain layout in more detail. This design we called Urban Toxic Wasteland, and it's a volcanic sort of landscape that feathers into a more urban district. First of all, the client was worried about the light colour of the tarmac impacting too much on the volcanic sector. So I've revisited this and made it a lot darker. I also felt that the buildings on the left hand of the board gave too much of an advantage over the other side. So I started to explore the idea of raising the rockwork up on the right hand side, or the volcanic sector. Although this looked great and gave the board a real good dynamic, on reflection however, we actually decided, looking at this terrain layout, that would give too much of an advantage of players looking down onto the road. Also, looking at the height of the cliff, it would be impossible for the defending troops to assault, creating a very unbalanced game. We still had the problem of the buildings on the far left overlooking the terrain, so more cover would have to be given to the troops who are actually advancing across the table. In this final version, which the client opted for, we reduced the height of the mountains and took that away completely, and added more rockwork on the far right, so troops actually entering the table would have more ground cover. Again, we can see the advantages of having a 3D virtual model. By zooming in and skimming the ground at effectively miniature height, we can see what cover each miniature would have whilst trying to come across the bridge. We can also look from the defender's point of view and see if the bridge can actually be seen, which is obviously a very important part that the client wanted. He wanted to enable his troops to come on the board but have cover and a deployment area where he could set up his troop formations ready for the final assault. Another thing to bear in mind is what you're looking at is not some fancy render. This is actually real-time rendering. This is what I see when I'm actually designing the board. So it's very fast and quick for me to actually zoom around and change things, which actually gives me a huge advantage when actually designing and planning out the layout. Okay, let's have a look at the 3 final renders and see how they compare. With the urban change in colour and the abandonment of the large raised rockwork, this is what we finally ended up with. So this is what I then used to create the actual finished boards, and I used this as a guide, measuring off the different points to get my heights for the rockwork. And here's the finished project. You can see that it's very close to the 3D model, although obviously some changes are made. Throughout the construction phase, I decided to increase the rockwork on the far right hand side by the bridge even further, creating a little plateau where the troops could oversee the buildings. Increasing the rockwork at this point gave some amazing features, and also gave the advantage of the troops some cover whilst overlooking the buildings on the far left. We were both really pleased how these boards came out, and I also included the flexibility of having these road sections being able to be switched, enabling alternative layouts to be achieved. Let's go ahead and look at some more ways in which the 3D software can help us develop the design of the boards. This is a current board that I'm working on at the moment. This design is for a 4 foot by 8 foot board and based on the film Dune. I used the software to split these two components up, as I wanted the tops of the towers to be removed so miniatures could be placed inside. It's fantastic to be able to use the software in this way and develop boards that are quite complicated, and they don't get much more complicated than this. This is a Warhammer 40,000 board. It's so complicated, the best way is actually to hide some of the board while I concentrate on other areas, so I could concentrate on the areas that I really wanted to. This was a great example of the 3D in action. These parts were put together. One was a statue and the other was a GW part. neither of which I had at the time, but by using images from the internet, I managed to be able to give the client a good idea of what the piece would look like. When it comes to constructing highly complicated pieces like this, cost is obviously going to be an issue, as I have to buy these parts in. So it's important to know how many parts we need to create the image that we're looking at. Using some simple mathematics, we can count up how many parts we can see within the design, which enable me to work out a cost of how much we need to spend on these parts. Let's look at what changes we can make by using third-party parts. We can lower these buildings here to see what the effect will have on the overall design. We can actually increase the size of these buildings, effectively adding more parts to the project. This of course will actually increase the project cost, but at least it gives us the opportunity to explore these elements, without buying the GW parts first, which of course would be very expensive. Although we could use these parts elsewhere in the project, it would mean ultimately that the whole project would go over budget, which wouldn't be good at all. So let's look at saving some money. So we remove the extra height on these towers, and we'll remove the Shrine of Aquila. This is bound to save us some money, as the temple is quite an expensive part. This has left us with rather a large gap, so let's copy this building on the right hand side and paste that on the left hand side and see if that helps. This is a great way of exploring whether or not we need to buy third-party parts. As most of the information is on the internet, I can get images from that and then paste them into the design, giving you the advantage of trying different parts that maybe you don't need to purchase. This method is perfect for buildings that you may already have, as you can send me images of these and I can actually place them into the design. You'll be able to see what your own buildings look like on the boards even before the boards have been made. And just as a finish, let's have a look at how these boards turned out. They are amazingly detailed and took many months to make. You can see looking at the final boards that although they don't look exactly like the 3D model, as to build it exactly the same would have taken many months just to build the 3D model. But it was enough to show the client and he could agree that we both saw the same vision and he was happy to proceed and let me have free rein on the rest of the construction. Okay, thanks very much for watching this movie on the designing process that I do. I hope that was of his interest and gives you a bit more of an insight into the work I do behind the scenes and how I plan out designing a board. I hope to catch you on the next movie. Thanks very much for watching and for subscribing.